SAR today. So my name is Jonathan Burrows. I'm the business manager for the Safeguarding Adults Partnership in Stockport. I'm going to be leading some of the discussions early on in the call today, and then I'm going to pass over to some colleagues who are going to share some of the learning as well. So if I could just take a minute to introduce everyone on the call, if that's okay. So Nikki, if I can come to you first, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Nikki Chester. I'm the Domestic Abuse Training Manager and the Victim Voice Domestic Abuse Facilitator within the Safeguarding Partnership.
Thanks, Nikki. Julia?
Afternoon, everybody. I'm Julia Newton. I'm the Principal Social Worker in Adult Social Care and Head of Safeguarding and Dolls.
Thanks, Julia. Sarah Higgins?
Hi, I'm Sarah Higgins. I'm a Housing Options Team Leader at Stockport Homes.
Thanks, Sarah. And Lee Wolf.
Thanks, Jonathan. Afternoon, everybody. Lee Wolf, named professional for adult safeguarding at Stockport NHS Foundation Trust.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. So we're collectively going to take you all through this session this afternoon. At the end, we'll stop the recording, and like I said, we'll have a bit of an opportunity for questions and discussions afterwards. So over the next 90 minutes, we're going to talk through a couple of big things for everyone. We're going to understand what the purpose of a Safeguarding Adults Review is, what that criteria is, why we do them, and why they're so important to us in Stockport. We're going to talk about Amy. We're going to learn about her experiences and as a system, what we've learned and how we're taking that forwards across Stockport. And then most importantly, whenever we do these events, it's really good hearing about all the learning and the information available, but actually, why is it so important that we share this? What does it mean for our roles today, working in Stockport, working in the system, and how we learn from Amy's experiences? So we're going to have a bit of a reflection at the end on that. Whenever we do these sessions, it's always really interesting and really helpful, I think, just to really ground ourselves and understand, so we're all on the same page, who we are and why we've come together. So a lot of you on the call may understand and already know about the Safeguarding Adults Partnership. For some of you, this may be the first time you're hearing or coming along to one of our events. So I just want to spend 2 minutes talking through and introducing the idea of the Safeguarding Partnership. So we are a strategic partnership involved in safeguarding adults, as the name suggests. The Care Act sets out an expectation and a statutory function for all local authority areas in England to establish a strategic partnership which comes together and seeks assurance around the effectiveness of safeguarding delivery for adults with care and support needs. We're led by an independent chair and scrutineer. Brad Howe has been with us since December last year. Our previous chair was in post for about 4 years, so we always make sure that we refresh and we have that truly independent voice at the helm of the partnership. Within the team, there's myself as business manager, and then Susan Holroyd is my quality assurance officer. So we are quite a small team coordinating the function of that partnership, and because of that, we're really reliant and we work really closely with a lot of our partners across the system there. So you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, I've split them up into 2 categories. We have what are called our statutory partners. So they are the local authority, police, Greater Manchester Police, and the Integrated Care Board, NHS Greater Manchester. They are the 3 partners named in the legislation that have that statutory core function around safeguarding effectiveness across the system. But we're also really keen to involve as many other partners as we can in a lot of the work that we do. So Fire and Rescue, our 2 trusts, Pennine and Stockport, housing providers, probation services, lots and lots of partner organisations who have a voice and have an impact on delivery of safeguarding for adults with care and support needs come together. And today is a great example of how we do that, how we come together as a partnership, look at the learning and share it out from there. And one of the big changes that we've seen in the partnership over the last 2 years is how we engage and hear the voice of adults with lived experience. So we have a board member that sits on the partnership board who has accessed our services before, and she's co-chair of one of our subgroups. And that's something that we're really looking to expand over the coming years in Stockport. One of the core functions that we have to complete as a safeguarding partnership under the Care Act are what's called Safeguarding Adults Reviews. Some of you may already be aware of this. Some of you, this is the first time you're hearing it. So I just want to contextualize what we're talking about today. So Safeguarding Adults Reviews, or SARs. Section 44 of that Care Act is really clear what the criteria needs to be to conduct one of these reviews. And if we meet the criteria, we haven't got a choice. It's set out in the legislation that we have to do these reviews. Section 44 sets it out in a lot more wordy than I have on the slide here, but I'm just going to talk for 2 minutes through these 3 different criteria. So the first 2 are what we call a mandatory review. We have to complete these reviews regardless of what those circumstances are. So the first one is looking at an adult with care and support needs who has died as a result of abuse or neglect, and we have concerns around multi-agency working. The second criteria, again, looks at an adult with care and support needs, but someone that has survived serious abuse or neglect and that may have died had it not been for a particular intervention. And again, we're still looking for that multi-agency learning there. The third criteria is what we call a discretionary review. That's where the first 2 criteria haven't been met in full, but we've got the powers to conduct some sort of learning review outside of that at our discretion. And that's what we're doing today. When we talk about Amy, I'll explain why we're using that discretionary power to complete the review today. So just want to spend 2 minutes introducing Amy, and then we'll talk about some of the learning there. Just so everyone's aware, Amy met 3rd criteria, but she did sadly die last year. So a bit of a health warning, and I would put it on the invitation, but we are going to be talking about Amy's death. So just bringing Amy into the call with us all today. Amy was 51 years old when she died in 2025. She'd lived in Stockport all of her life, and she enjoyed arts and crafts and received support from the local authority to access community activities. She had a pet cat who was extremely important to her, and Amy took pride in her appearance. She experienced significant past trauma, including domestic abuse, and she struggled to manage on a daily basis due to her alcohol dependency and bulimia. She experienced abusive relationships and periods of homelessness, and during a period of rehabilitation, her father passed away, and safeguarding concerns were raised regarding suspected financial abuse. In 2025, Amy died due to bleeding and pneumonia. And because that was listed as the medical cause of death for Amy, it didn't directly reference abuse or neglect. We hadn't met that mandatory SAR criteria, so we used the powers as a discretionary power because we really identified as a partnership there was some real important learning for us to capture and share. So why did we complete the review into Amy? There was 5 big things that we really wanted to focus on when we came together as a partnership after adult social care, put that referral in, that we wanted to learn from and review. So the first one looked at the risk management planning and information sharing between partners. We were interested in looking at full multi-agency representation and involvement in safeguarding processes. That multi-agency coordination of support when someone like Amy, who has complex needs, are facing significant life changes. We wanted to make sure that staff were aware of signs and indicators of domestic abuse. And we wanted to have that understanding of an individual's history of trauma or previous experiences to shape their current interventions and how we come together as a system and an MDT to support them with that full information. And those are the 5 big things that really shone out in Amy's review and the referral that we wanted to explore a bit further. So what do we know about Amy's experiences? We know that Amy had frequent contact with multiple services. I've pulled out an example there. She had repeated emergency department attendances linked to her alcohol use. And there was a particular 3-month period where she attended 15 times in ED. She had GP involvement for both her physical and her mental health needs. She received input from adult social care, and she was known to drug and alcohol services. She experienced domestic abuse from both her father historically and her partner at the time of her death. And she often disclosed domestic abuse in hospital settings, but we saw in some instances she was discharged back into the community where she had access to environments and individuals that posed risk to her. But what we did note was that while she was disclosing domestic abuse in hospital, there was a level of trust and a level of working with some of the individuals in ED that Amy had built up because she was known to those services. She had several safeguarding concerns raised, and those led to multi-agency meetings being held. And as I mentioned, she experienced several critical stresses over a very short period of time. These included the death of her father, eviction and housing instability, an ongoing abusive relationship, physical health deterioration. Amy was supported to access a rehabilitation placement, and at the time of her death, there was ongoing police investigation into financial abuse by her partner. So some of the headline learning that we pulled out from this work: we knew that Amy had a history involvement from a number of different services, and there were several MDTs, multidisciplinary team meetings, and team around the adult meetings that were held to support Amy. Unfortunately, what we also saw was that not all of those meetings had the right organisations represented or including, and what that meant was full information sharing wasn't always able to take place. That wider picture, that wider system look at what was happening, rather than treating the kind of presenting issue, digging under the surface, wasn't always possible in all of those meetings. We know that Amy experienced domestic abuse from her father and her partner. That wasn't always fully identified by professionals, including some of those instances when she presented at the emergency department and then was discharged back into her father's care. Amy had a pet cat. I mentioned when I introduced Amy onto the call, she had a pet cat that was important to her. What we understood looking back over the records was that the pet cat was used as a form of coercion and control by her partner. Amy didn't fully disclose domestic abuse from her partner, and there was a level of fear that she had around the harm that would come to her pet had she disclosed that. So that was a real indicator of coercion and control, which we'll talk about later on. She experienced a number of traumatic incidents in very short succession. Like I mentioned, those included the death of a father, homelessness, physical health concerns. Her heightened stress and anxiety wasn't always fully considered by the MDT. And again, that links back to that kind of broader look at information sharing, that coming together, making sure we've got all the right individuals that we need at the table. Apologies. We know that Amy accessed a rehabilitation placement for her alcohol dependency. While she was in there, there wasn't full clarity across all individuals how services would remain involved once she was in the placement. But more importantly, once she was discharged back into the community, that happened 3 months sooner than was planned. The MDT weren't informed Amy was back in the community. So again, there was a level of information sharing and learning that we had around that broader support of what happens post-discharge. So I've painted a bit of a picture in things that we looked at. One of the things that we're always really keen to do in SARS is not just look at where the learning is, but look at what we can learn from good practice. And in this case, there was actually quite a lot of good practice that we saw and that we were able to identify. And in particular, there was a very strong multi-agency working history for Amy. There was a really strong MDT in place, but like I've said, that didn't always fully include everyone that we'd want to see. And it didn't start back up again once she was released from that rehabilitation placement in the way that we would wanted to have seen. There was a lot of thinking outside the box, and that included an example of adult social care funding a placement that Amy normally wouldn't have met the criteria for. So there was a real kind of sense of that coming together and understanding how we can support her in the right way. Professionals supported Amy with a Clare's Law disclosure. She had support from an IDVA around the domestic abuse. And there was an example in the chronology of Amy's GP very clearly documenting a structured capacity assessment before she refused hospital admission there. So again, there was some really good examples of how we work to understand Amy's circumstances, her understanding, her capacity, and her consent. But there is obviously some practice learning that we need to take forward and identify where things could have been strengthened and how we improve for the future. None of this is said through a lens or criteria of looking to apportion blame for anyone. This is always about learning and that continual improvement that we have in Stockport. So I've mentioned the multi-agency working. Not all safeguarding meetings for Amy included all relevant professionals, which led to some delays and gaps in information sharing. The example that we've pulled out here, Amy was accessing community support from the Stockport NHS Foundation Trust, but the safeguarding team at the Trust wasn't always included and consulted in some of those safeguarding meetings, so weren't able to share their information and what they were seeing from Amy. Her discharge back into the community after the rehabilitation placement happened earlier than was expected. The MDT wasn't fully aware of that, so again, didn't pick back up as quickly as it could have done. Trauma-informed practice was a real key learning point for us when we look back over the records for Amy. Practitioners didn't always fully understand the wider context of Amy's needs and behaviours because we saw that information sharing learning. So some of those interventions didn't always address the root cause of her behaviours that were treating the presenting issue at that time. There was some key learning around domestic abuse and how we identify as a system the signs and indicators of domestic abuse, and in particular that coercion and control. I know Nikki's going to talk to us in a bit of detail about domestic abuse in just a moment. And then pulling all of this together, sitting under that, there was some relearning around Amy's consent and capacity. We saw that she withdrew disclosures or minimised harm. There wasn't always sufficient or professional curiosity to explore some of these behaviours and really understand what was going on for Amy, linked to some of her trauma history and that domestic abuse.
So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of the learning in respect of Amy in relation to mental capacity and consent. And we know that mental capacity and consent comes up, you know, throughout our learning in the safeguarding adult world, and it's a national learning point around SARS as well. So really, Amy's capacity fluctuated. Obviously, alcohol played a part in that. And it's just that bit around us always remembering about cases involving alcohol dependency require routine, repeated capacity assessment. So, you know, just because of one day that she might be assessed as having capacity, it's likely to fluctuate, and just being really aware of that. She declined some interventions while, you know, and was assessed as having capacity. But often agencies accepted the decision on face value, even where there was coercion, fear, or trauma responses were likely, and decisions appeared inconsistent and contradictory. And I suppose the bit that is key around that Jonathan's already touched upon, that bit about seeing not just the presenting issue on that day in front of you, actually a wider picture around Amy's behaviours, etc., and her, you know, and some of the sort of risk profile, as it were. So there were multiple self-discharges from hospital, and that was not always with a structured capacity assessment and robust safety planning. So there were some gaps there around, obviously, you know, showing you working out around those discharges and around those capacity assessments. So just the key bits really, that capacity assessments are decision and time specific. We all know that, but it's good to be reminded. And they must include an exploration of influence or pressure. So Jonathan touched upon earlier on as well around that real pressure around Amy's cat, and obviously the impact that that had around her decision making, around her potential abuser caring for that cat, etc. So really working through some of that is so important when we're having these conversations. And one of the things, if you take away nothing from today, one of the really key things that, you know, would be the best thing to take away, if nothing else, is that bit about showing you working out. So an assessment is as much about the process and the discussion and documenting that, not just about the outcome. So really list about, you know, when we're looking at capacity assessments, what are the actual questions that you've actually asked Amy as part of that, to then to draw out your decision making in respect of her capacity. Be really specific about that, and what wider things have you also considered as well? How have you approached that to enable her, obviously, as much as possible, to be able to still remain and be empowered to be in control, but really making sure you've fully explored her reasoning, sort of an understanding. Next slide, Jonathan, please. So just those key messages again, really about balancing autonomy and safety. So, you know, as practitioners, we must navigate respecting autonomy while also preventing that serious harm through that sort of dynamic capacity assessments. And I suppose the bit that I wanted to stress is the presence of capacity does not remove the safeguarding responsibilities that we all hold. So just because we do assess somebody on a point in time around a specific decision that they've got capacity, we do still have safeguarding responsibilities to make sure that we've got safety plans, protection plans, and involving Amy as much as possible around that in place, and that we're fully understanding that. In this situation, there were some concerns in respect of financial abuse as well. So when we've got sort of complex sort of multifaceted capacity assessments, special attentions are needed for those financial decisions where exploitation is suspected. So we need a specific capacity assessment and risk assessment as well in respect of managing Amy's finances, and that wasn't always clearly sort of documented as well. And, we've talked about some of the real strengths, and there were real strengths around that multi-agency collaboration here, but just obviously the failure really to stand that back up again as robustly as we needed at the time that she came out of the rehab back into the community. But the real key point around that multi-agency approach is that shared risk management through those multi-agency meetings, so we're not then getting siloed responses, and that improves our safeguarding. So something you'll hear us talk a lot about within the partnership, it's certainly coming out in our subgroups, is that the importance of multi-agency working, and that's not just within safeguarding, but also thinking about that, building that really bigger picture around risk, rather than just that maybe that discharge on that day or that intervention out in the community. Actually, a lot had been going on for Amy for a considerable period of time, and did professionals have that wider picture? So were we recognising patterns of repeated high risk decisions really that involved Amy? So just being mindful of that when we're in and working with somebody like Amy. And then my last message, which I've said before, just always think about that clear documentation around decision making and your rationale. That accountability around that is so key, and that's your defensible decision making and showing you're working out, as we call it.
Thanks, Julia. I'm going to introduce Nikki now, who's going to talk to us around some of the domestic abuse learning.
Thanks, Jonathan. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to highlight some of the domestic abuse learning and look at how we understand how past trauma, so in Amy's case, that childhood abuse in an abusive relationship, how it can impact the current risk and behaviour, and how it can impact a person's engagement with services. And look at how we can improve practitioners' ability to identify domestic abuse, specifically around coercion and control that Jonathan's already mentioned, that Amy was subject to. And look at that, how we can apply professional curiosity to understand what risks are, specifically in relation to coercion and control, and when we're looking at discharge, and when people are going into back into the community. So when I kind of looked at the report for Amy, one thing that stuck out to me was that opportunities to identify domestic abuse were missed due to a lack of professional curiosity and incomplete understanding of Amy's circumstances. So I wanted to highlight really, what does professional curiosity mean in your role? Next slide, please. So when we're looking at professional curiosity, it's looking at understanding what's happening for a person, rather than having those assumptions on ourselves, rather than taking things at face value, which we did see sometimes within Amy. being professionally curious, it's necessary for us to fully understand, get the bigger picture of a situation, and really look at the risk that individual's facing, which we may not see. We may not immediately see, they may not be obvious. And specifically for coercion and control, it's really crucial because of the hidden nature. We want to be looking at what is happening, what is really going on in that person's life. Who visits, who lives with or regularly visits that person. And there we'll be looking at identifying the environment, the relationships, and as professionals, it will help us spot support networks. It'll help us spot possible risk factors. Who makes decisions in the household? Does that person have control over everyday life? Do they have autonomy? Are they able to make decisions themselves? And that may be around money, healthcare, daily activities. And it's really important to identify this in the context of coercive and controlling behaviour. When we're looking at discharge and safe sustainability, what happens when a professional is not present? What is it like outside of that formal care? And when we're looking at those power imbalances, is the person dependent? So was Amy dependent around care, around housing, around money? We've already heard that she was dependent on her partner for looking after a pet cat. Now we know that abuse of pets, abuse of animals is a real heightened risk factor within domestic abuse. And it's an element that we often see. Those who cause harm will use that emotional abuse when there are pets involved. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So just wanted to touch on understanding domestic abuse and coercion and control. When we hear the term domestic abuse, it's not just about physical. It's about all those types of abuse that you can see on the screen. It's that emotional, economic, financial, sexual, physical, and psychological. But within all of those types of abuse, there will be an element of coercion and control. So I always say that there will be a thread of coercion and control in all types of those abuse. And it's really important. It's not always a visible injury. Coercion and control will be a pattern. It won't be a single incident. It will be a pattern that will escalate over time. And like I say, it's it can be really hidden. We've heard Amy refer to her father being okay with other people, being quite nice with other people, but not with her. So you can have the most plausible, the most likable person within the community, but they may still have coercive and controlling behaviour traits. Next slide. So just some indicators to highlight around coercion and control. So you may see that there's frequent cancelled or missed appointments, which we did see some of those with Amy, and that may be that Amy may not have been allowed to attend those appointments. She may have been isolated, and very different reasons why she may have cancelled or missed those appointments. Her partner or her father speaking on behalf of Amy. Professionals may have seen that on occasions her father was present a lot during visits to healthcare. But I did want to highlight here how Amy did have a level of trust within ED. and that's probably because of the most frequent visits that she had, and they were able to have a rapport and gain a relationship with her, which is when Amy has then disclosed that she has been abused historically by her father, and then abused by her partner. She may, that some victim survivors, if they are being coercively controlled, they will not engage with people, they'll not engage with professionals, and that's purely due to the fear. So within coercion and control, there will always be an element of fear. And that may be that if somebody does engage with professionals and the person causing harm is there, then there will be consequences after. There is always a consequence with coercive and controlling behaviour, and that consequence could either be physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, financial. Like I said, it's embedded within all types of abuse. May see sudden changes in the presentation or behaviour with somebody who is being coercively controlled, and that may be because a victim survivor of domestic abuse will change their behaviour to survive, to remain safe. So it's really important to look out for those behaviours. Financial difficulties, despite income, we may see that if somebody's being financially controlled, then they don't have access to their own finances. It may be that they're just given a very, very small amount of money, but they don't have access to any of the finances for them to live. And like I say, with coercion and control, it's that fear, it's that anxiety. And it may well be that you may ask a question to somebody at the first visit, and then towards the end of that visit, they may give you inconsistent accounts because of the fear element that coercive and controlling behaviour has. There will the victim survivor will always be in fear of their abuser. So looking at those risks, and specifically with adults and Amy with a history of abuse, and that may increase the risk at transition or discharge points. We saw that unfortunately Amy was discharged into environments where control did still exist. And some of the practical implications of that is, don't rely solely on the current presentation. Validate decisions against known history. Amy was really vocal about being abusive, about being abused by her father. And ensure when we ask victim survivors about domestic abuse, it's not a one-off event. It's a process that should be asked about frequently. So, and ensure that you can have a conversation in private, and that means speaking so that the victim survivor can speak freely. They can speak freely and they feel safe to speak. And that will mean that we can look at the reduced risk of coercion. We can look at that reduced risk of intimidation. That trauma-informed, Julia has made reference to this. Take into account the past history, the past experience of trauma, and obviously within Amy's case, it was around that domestic abuse and around that childhood abuse. And looking at that multi-agency, gather different services, gather information from the different services. We know that meetings did happen, but maybe we know that certain people were missing. And within that, with all that combined knowledge, that will build a fuller, more accurate risk picture for a victim survivor of coercion and control. Next slide, please. So when we are looking at trauma, you know, the current vulnerability cannot be fully understood without recognising the impact of that past trauma. And specifically in Amy's case, including the abuse experienced in childhood and in her relationship. So when we're looking at trauma and what, you know, what does normal feel like? If somebody has grown up with or lived in an abusive household, abusive relationship, harmful behaviours, they can become familiar and they may become expected by that victim survivor. Looking at that tolerance of controlling behaviour, repeated exposure to abuse can increase a person's tolerance or acceptance of that control. And trauma can affect whether somebody can identify behaviours. So when we're looking at that ability to recognise behaviours, sometimes trauma gets in the way and a victim survivor can't actually recognise those behaviours. And in that trust in professionals, especially if there's been a poor relationship, it will affect that engagement. But you know, we saw that Amy did have a real good level of trust within ED. So what looks like choice may be shaped by trauma, it may be shaped by fear, or it may be shaped by that learned behaviour when you've been brought up in a household where there has been abuse. So what I want to look at now is looking at recognising the impact of past abuse. This means understanding the previous experiences of that abuse or trauma, and that can shape how a person thinks, how a person feels, how a person behaves. And we saw that in Amy quite a lot in her behaviour. And we want to adopt, with trauma-informed practice, we want to adopt a non-blaming approach, removing judgment, specifically around coercion and control, and avoiding blaming the person, so avoiding that victim blaming. And a victim survivor, like I said before, their behaviours are often around coping. So they may behave in the way that in a certain way to cope or to survive, and they may not be poor choices. They may just be using those choices to survive that coercion and control. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So just pull this together, how past abuse may present. There may be that reluctance to disclose. But we can see with Amy, when she was building that rapport, that relationship with professionals in ED, she was quite happy to disclose domestic abuse within her relationship. And we do see sometimes that there is a loyalty to the person who's causing the harm, or a victim survivor may minimise the risk. They may say, you know what, it's not that bad. It's not. They may not understand or recognise that it is domestic abuse, and you may see. You know, I deliver a lot of training to health colleagues where they do say that, you know, they see within victim survivors that anxiety, that shutdown, that avoidance of those questions. So if professionals were to look at, next point please, Jonathan. If professionals don't explore the history, then we're going to miss those patterns of abuse. That we're not going to see the full picture of that risk. It's going to be underestimated, specifically if the victim survivor is minimising. And those discharge decisions may be unsafe, as we did see sometimes with Amy. So it's really important to look at that past abuse and that past trauma. Past trauma with a current controlling partner, we're going to get heightened risks. They're not separate issues. We need to be looking at these together so we can do a real full robust risk assessment. So looking at some trauma-informed questions, you know, these are, you probably do all these, they're just a bit of a refresher. Has this person experienced abuse before? What are the patterns? What is happening? Are they repeating? How might past experiences affect how safe they feel speaking openly? You know, have professionals managed to speak to victim survivors on their own? And is their agreement genuinely informed and voluntary? You know, are they being pressured into speaking, or not being allowed to speak at all, and somebody speaking on their behalf? So encourage that gentle, non-judgmental, create those opportunities for safe disclosures, and sometimes silence, you know, can be a potential risk. So recognise that. You know, if somebody is not saying things, just recognise that. And like I said before, domestic abuse is not a one-off event. Asking about it is a process. And just to some reflections and just to pull everything together, domestic abuse is often hidden and non-physical. Coercion and control relies on power and dependence. Professional curiosity is essential, not optional. Discharge planning must consider real life context and relationships, and really understanding who is involved in a person's life is central to safeguarding.
Thanks, Nikki. I just wanted to pick up and highlight and reinforce one of the points. One of the big things that we saw in Amy's case was this idea of trauma-informed practice. And I know Nikki's walked us through what that means and some reflections and how we can work with it on a day-to-day basis. And it's language that we kind of throw about in adult safeguarding. We're just really checking that we understand we've all got that kind of same understanding there, and recognizing that it can arise, and it's predominantly linked to domestic abuse, exploitation, but also childhood trauma, or ACEs. Some of you may have heard that acronym before, adverse childhood experiences. And we're looking at how that can impact an adult's memory and disclosure, trust in professionals, and or emotional regulation in their decision making. Some of the signs that Nikki's already spoken to are on the left there, but I suppose one of the key reflections that we wanted to push was asking yourself as a practitioner, what's happened to this person rather than what is wrong with them. It's really shifting that focus in that lens through which we work with them and support them on a day-to-day basis, and understanding that historic trauma and how we use that to influence and shape what we're doing in that moment with that person. So it doesn't replace safeguarding duties, but this idea behind trauma-informed practice does encourage that balance between protection and empowerment, professional curiosity, which is spoken about rather than assumptions, and reflective practice when individuals disengage or decline support. And a lot of what Nikki's already spoken about really talks to some of that. So some of those key takeaway messages are that taking time to build rapport and trust and explain with processes clearly. Again, we've seen in Amy's case, there was a level of that happening in the ED at the trust. So really building on that and making sure that we're creating those environments and those spaces for the person, offer those choices wherever it's possible to promote collaboration, autonomy and control for the person. Be mindful of what those triggers could be. So a particular environment, language, tone of voice, the way that we talk to individuals. It sounds obvious, but just being mindful that could be a trigger for them, depending on the type of trauma they've experienced historically. And working at the person's pace. As Nikki said, again, this isn't a one-off conversation. It's a way of working with them. It's revisiting it and making sure that we're working with that person, putting them at the center of it, and working at a speed and a pace that is kind of workable for them. Sarah, can I invite you now to talk about some of the homelessness prevention work happening in Stockport homes?
Yeah. So for anybody that's not familiar with our service, we manage the homeless service on behalf of Stockport Council. So anybody can be referred into the housing options team, and that's usually people who are homeless or threatened with homelessness within 56 days. You do need consent off the individual. As part of our prevention offer, we've got the homeless hospital advocate as well, who is based within Steppenhill Hospital, and that's Laura Burgess, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Laura's part funded by the NHS now, so she's done a lot of work with the staff at the NHS to try and embed that service within the hospital, within the trust, to try and pick people up at a very, very early preventative stage. And Amy was one of those cases that were picked up quite early by Laura, and Laura was involved quite heavily with Amy's case and did a lot of work to try and safeguard Amy when she was to and from hospital, going into temporary accommodation, trying to settle her into rehab as well, and making sure the cat went with her, because that was a really supportive factor for Amy. Sadly, when we did manage to get her settled into her own accommodation, that's when she sadly passed away. But I think that that hospital advocate is a crucial part to these cases, these really complex cases, and to try and safeguard them and maybe pull together some of these multi-agency meetings. So if you do have to refer anybody through, just refer them through to us. If they're in hospital, you can refer them straight through to Laura. If it's anybody that's out of borough, so if they don't actually have a connection to Stockport, a lot of the time we can have cases that are on Arden and Norbury ward who have been placed out of borough. Laura will still assist them, but she'll assist them to try and repatriate them to safe accommodation in their own borough. So yeah, that's a quick whistle-stop tour of the prevention offer in Stockport.
Thanks for that, Sarah. Really helpful. Lee, can I come to you now? You're going to talk us through how you've addressed some of the learning from Amy in the trust, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jonathan. And again, I suppose in Amy's case, you know, we've already identified that there were missed opportunities really to identify domestic abuse, including during some ED attendances and through a discharge. But I think ultimately what we've identified from the learning is the importance of that professional curiosity and the completion of DASH assessments, making sure that those DASH assessments are done promptly. And just for the purpose of anybody within the room that is asking what a DASH assessment is, it's the Domestic Abuse, Stalking, Harassment Risk Assessment tool. And that's one of the key learnings that we've identified here within the trust. What we've also looked at is that a domestic abuse risk should be considered at every attendance, admission and discharge point. Those DASH assessments are completed in a timely way where domestic abuse is suspected. We ensure that those assessments take place in a safe, private and quiet environment to support that open disclosure. And that's one of the key learnings really from this, is about what we've identified in Amy's case, is that there were times where Amy's dad were present during her ED attendance. And I think it's just having that element of curiosity really into around, is it proportionate? Is it really practical to be having those conversations in front of family members when really we could potentially be waiting for a more reasonable or proportionate time when she's alone and feels safe to speak freely without any distractions in the room. And again, work at the person's pace, allowing time to build trust, and don't rely solely on presentation. And again, it's going back to what Nikki was talking about, thinking about that root cause analysis and understanding really the trauma history, the background into the coercion and control, and how we then can deliver a safety net plan to think about who else we need to be getting involved with to facilitate that safe discharge. And I think there has been times as well, particularly from the presentations with Amy, where what we have identified is that she had discharged herself from the department without being seen at times. And I know from a trust perspective, we had followed that through to check on her welfare to make sure she was safe. But again, had we been able to engage with other partner services to check her welfare and share that information, that may have also been an opportunity for us to be working more collaboratively with other agencies as well to ensure that she was safe when she left the department or she'd been discharged. And again, I think it's really key to identify there around that professional curiosity, as we've alluded to understand who's involved in the person's life and whether they're safe to return home. And I think it's really key, isn't it, about that safety discharge plan, you know, and had safeguarding concerns being escalated sooner to ourselves or the safeguarding adult team, that's where, you know, we're then able to provide that additional support to the department around that consideration and the appropriate referrals to those services. And that said as well, I think it's really important to identify that there is learning, but there's also good practice as well, where we can see that, you know, referrals have been done with consent of Amy to other services such like Stockport Without Abuse and Stockport Homes to look at those services. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Jonathan. And I think really what we wanted to identify here is some of the key changes really that we've introduced into the trust, in particular over the recent months. And what we've identified or recruited within our organisation so far is a recruitment drive to look at domestic abuse champions. And to date, we've recruited 45 of those within the organisation, with 21 of those trained to date so far. We've also identified 3 further training sessions throughout this financial year to provide that support to our domestic abuse champions and to strengthen the compliance and workforce capability so that those champions are then able to provide that advice and that support to the workforce and where necessary support with those completion of DASH risk assessments also. The domestic abuse link role, that's something that we've also implemented on a bi-monthly basis, where we now supporting champions with that local, regional and national updates. And certainly what we will be doing is sharing the learning from Amy along with this learning circle at the next link role meeting. And we will also be disseminating the 7-minute briefing widely across the organisation to embed that learning more consistently.
Thanks, Lee. So I suppose I just wanted to take a bit of a minute just to reflect. We always use these opportunities to kind of share the learning, but it sometimes feels like there's a lot of information thrown without that reflection of kind of what it means for a practitioner in the system today, and how is this affecting your role. So we hope that we've shared some of those key practice messages, some of those key takeaways. I'm just going to drop a link to Amy's 7-minute briefing in the chat there. That is on a 1-page guide, just to recap some of the key things that were spoken about today, and how you can kind of reflect and use that and share the learning from this case. The Safeguarding Partnership has an online policy and procedures website. That is the TriX on the top left-hand side of the screen there. That's the website link that we can use to share. And there's lots and lots of information on there that's constantly updated with relevant legislation changes, practice changes. So there's a wealth of information to support multi-agency safeguarding up there. Penine Care run routine professional curiosity training that's open to everyone to attend. The dates for that are always in the Safeguarding Partnership newsletter. If anyone hasn't got those, please do reach out to me through the Safeguarding Partnership website, and we can make sure that you've got access to those training dates and really push some of that professional curiosity training. Spoken about the 7-minute briefing that's in the chat now there. And then also Nikki works for the local authority's domestic abuse service, and the domestic abuse partnership have their own website. The web address is there. And again, a bit similar to the safeguarding partnership world, there's lots and lots of resources, information, practice guides, learning sessions on there that you can use to access at your own speed, at your own pace, and really absorb that and reflect on kind of what it means and how we can come together to share some of this learning. So I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you to all the guest speakers today. Thank you for everyone for coming along, and we'll have a bit of an opportunity now. We've got 30 minutes left to talk through any kind of questions, discussions and reflections that you may have.